They knew everything already in 1890. The prophecy of Tesla and Trump. What if I told you that Nikola Tesla knew who would rule the world 130 years later? What he saw in the future can change everything you believe. And it may be too late. I was never the type who believes in conspiracy theories or stories about ancient manuscripts revealing apocalyptic secrets. But that was before I found that diary. It all started when I decided to renovate the attic of the house I inherited from my grandfather. He was a compulsive collector, collecting from stamps to old newspaper boxes dating back to the 19th century. In the middle of the mess, I found a locked box with a rusty lock, clearly forgotten for decades. I almost threw it out without thinking, but curiosity won. When I finally opened it, using an improvised key, I found a worn-out diary with Nikola Tesla engraved almost unreadable on the cover. It looked like one of those fake things you see selling at online auctions, but the notes inside were disturbingly specific. The first pages were difficult to read, written in a mixture of English and what seemed to be Serbian. But as I went along, one thing became clear. Tesla wasn't just speculating about the future. He was describing in frightening detail events that would happen more than a century later. One passage mentions a leader of orange skin who would claim great power through lies and distractions, while his descendant would open the doors to collapse. I was shivering, but tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a forced interpretation or a delusion of a mad genius. It was only when I reached the last page that something really left me paralyzed. My name, written by hand, along with the phrase, "He who reads, attracts the cycle." It was impossible. How could someone who lived in 1890 know my name? I read that last sentence about 10 times, trying to find some kind of explanation. My name was not common, and it was there perfectly written. My fingers started sweating as I flipped through the pages, looking for something to make it less absurd. But what I found only made things worse. In one of the entries, Tesla described a kind of experiment involving radio waves and parallel dimensions. He mentioned that certain frequencies could awaken the echoes of time, allowing messages to be sent into the future. It didn't make sense, but the idea stuck in my head. And then I started listening. It was like a low, almost imperceptible buzzing coming out of nowhere. I tried to ignore it, but it seemed to get louder the more I read. That night, I went to sleep with the diary locked in my office. But sleep did not come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw images of Tesla working in his workshop with machines that made no sense, generating lights that didn't look natural. Then he would stop, turn slowly, and look at me directly, as if he knew I was watching. I woke up covered in sweat, with the feeling that I was not alone in the room. My heart went wild when I realized the diary was in my bed, although I was sure that I had left it at the office. A single page was open, with a new message written in sloppy letters. The cycle has begun. At that moment, I felt my body freeze. It was as if the air had become heavy suddenly, and every sound in the house seemed amplified. The creaking of the walls, the wind outside, even the sound of my breath sounded too loud. Took the diary and went back to the office, locking the door behind me. I needed to understand that. I went straight to the paragraph that seemed newly written, trying to find some flaw that made me believe that it was just my mind playing tricks. But the paper did not lie. The ink was fresh, and the words "the cycle began" seemed to pulse. That's when I heard footsteps in the corridor. They were slow, drawn, and definitely not mine. I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia. Maybe it was the plumbing, or even the wind. but something in the cadence of those steps was human. I took my phone to call anyone, but the screen was dead, completely black, even with the battery full. The sound stopped right at the door of the office. I stood still, holding my breath as a grave silence took over the environment. I didn't have the courage to approach, but I could hear a slight vibration from the other side, as if something was there waiting. Suddenly the lights started to blink, and the sound came back, but this time it seemed closer, more insistent, like a hum that invaded my head. It was as if the diary were alive, pulling something into my world. I don't know how to describe the feeling that came next. It was as if something invisible had entered the room with me. The rumbling turned into a deep, almost deafening noise that seemed to emanate from every corner. I looked at the diary, still open on the table, and saw the words on the page begin to change right before my eyes. The letters organized themselves, forming new phrases. "You opened the door," he said now, and my stomach turned. Before I could react, the lights went out for good. The silence that followed was so absolute that I could hear the sound of my heart beating in my chest. In the darkness, a shadow began to form before me, denser than the very pitch around. It had no definite form, but was undeniably a presence. It seemed to vibrate, almost like the machines that Tesla described in his diary. Then I heard a voice, or something that sounded like a voice, directly in my head. It was low, drawn, as if it were coming from a very distant place. "You should not have read." The dread paralyzed me, and for a moment I thought my whole body was just going to shut down. The shadow approached slowly, until it seemed to be a few centimeters from me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, just stare as she hovered there, like she was studying me. The shadow began to writhe, like smoke in slow motion, and for a moment I had the impression of seeing a face emerging from within it. He was not human, at least not completely. The eyes, if I can call them that, were two deep holes that seemed to suck all the light around. My whole body was screaming for me to run, but it was as if something invisible was holding me there, forcing me to watch. Then the voice came back, but this time it was not just in my head. It echoed in the room, laden with a weight that made the floor vibrate. The cycle cannot be broken. My legs finally reacted, and I fell from the chair trying to get up. The diary was now on the floor, with pages flitting frantically alone, as if an invisible storm were inside the room. Suddenly it stopped, opened in a new page that I had not seen before. There was a series of strange, almost mesmerizing symbols and a single phrase in English. "You are the driver." The floor seemed to open up under me, and a sharp cold took over the environment. It was as if I was being pulled into something, a place that should not exist. Before I could react, I felt a crushing weight on my chest, as if something was trying to pull me into the diary. My eyes were fixed on the symbols on the page, which seemed to rotate and shine in an impossible way, as if they were made of something that did not belong to this world. The rumbling came back, now so loud that it seemed to be inside my head, forcing my skull to vibrate. Everything around me began to crumble, or at least it seemed. The walls of the office seemed to warp, as if they were being sucked into that damn book. I closed my eyes and tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was then that I felt something cold and rough in my hand. When I opened my eyes, I saw that the diary was closed, and the room was completely normal, as if nothing had happened. The lights were on, the walls untouched, and the sound had disappeared. But the strangest thing was the clock on the wall. It marked 3:33. I knew that I had started reading the diary around 11 p.m. Where did those hours go? took the diary and put it in the box where it came from, locking it with everything that was within reach. My instinct was to burn it, destroy it somehow, but something in me knew that it would only make things worse. After locking the diary in the box, I sat on the office floor, trying to control my breathing. My heart was still beating in my chest, and my mind was spinning, trying to understand what the hell had just happened. I took my phone to look for answers, but it was still out of service. While trying to restart it, I heard a sound coming from the attic. It was like a slow drag, as if something was being moved up there. My body became tense. I knew I was alone at home. That didn't make sense. I took a flashlight and, against all common sense, decided to go up to check. The stairs to the attic creaked with each step, which only increased the tension. When I finally opened the attic door, I saw that the mess before was completely different. Everything my grandfather had accumulated was stacked in an organized way, as if someone had spent hours putting everything together. But the worst was what I saw in the center of the attic. The box, which I had just locked in the office, was there open. The diary was at the top, with a new page written. My hands trembled as I approached to read. "You cannot escape," said the message. I stood there, staring at the diary, feeling a mixture of terror and disbelief. It was impossible that the box was in the attic. I locked her in the office just minutes ago. The feeling of being observed became stronger, almost palpable. My mind was telling me to go down, get out of that house, and never come back, but something in that diary seemed to be calling me. Against all logic, I reached out and turned the page. This time there was a drawing. He showed a figure in the attic holding a lantern. It was me. The more disturbing detail? Behind me, a huge shadow with the same distorted face I had seen before. I dropped the diary and turned instantly, lighting the attic with the lantern. There was nothing there, but the air looked different, denser, as if it were alive. I started to rush down the stairs, trying to ignore the sound of footsteps behind me, which were getting closer and closer. When I finally arrived at the office, the clock was 3:34, although I felt that an eternity had passed in the attic. I tried to open the front door to get out, but it was locked even without a key. Despair took hold of me, and I started to pull the handle with force until I heard that voice again. "You are the driver." This time she came close, so close that I felt the warm air on my back. I turned into a reflection, the lantern trembling in my hand, but the corridor was empty. Only that the air around me seemed to be moving, as if something invisible was circulating. I began to retreat, step by step, with the gaze fixed on the void before me, until something cold and solid touched my shoulder. It was enough for me to scream, turn the lantern frantically, but again there was nothing there. Just the oppressive silence and that horrible feeling that I was not alone. My body trembled so much that I almost let the flashlight fall. When I finally turned to the door, the diary was there on the floor, exactly where I was seconds ago. Without thinking, I took the diary and threw it across the hall. I just wanted it away from me, but as soon as he hit the wall, all the lights in the house went out. Everything. I was completely immersed in the darkness, with the sound of my own heart as the only indication that I was still alive. I tried to turn on the flashlight, but it was dead too. That's when I saw him. Two bright spots at the end of the hall, like eyes watching me. Don't know how long I stood, mesmerized by those dots, but then they started moving towards me slowly. One step, then another. And that's when I realized I was no longer in the corridor of my house. The surrounding space seemed to expand and change, the walls warping into shapes that defy any logic. As the bright eyes approached, the ground under my feet seemed to disappear. It was as if I were floating in a void, stuck between one place and another. My body was paralyzed, but my mind screamed for me to run away. I tried to move, but it was useless. It was as if something was holding me there. The eyes became closer until I could see something beyond them, a grotesque, fluid form, as if it were made of living shadows. She had no face, but I could feel her smiling, a smile that I didn't see, but felt deep in my soul. Suddenly, the thing stopped. The diary reappeared on the floor between me and her, open, with pages flipping furiously on their own. Then the silence was broken by a sharp, cutting sound that seemed to come from inside my head. It was impossible to look away as the words in the diary began to form themselves. The conductor completes the cycle. Before I could understand, the form advanced toward me. There was no impact, no pain, but everything became black. When I woke up, I was back in my office, the diary closed on my desk. The clock marked exactly 3:33 as before. The forgotten book that predicted Elon Musk and the end of the world. A book lost in time described with frightening precision Elon Musk and the destruction of the planet. Coincidence? Or was it a warning we ignored? I have always been fascinated by old books, those you find at garage fairs or in forgotten libraries. So when I stumbled upon a tiny bookstore during a trip to a small town in the Massachusetts countryside, I knew I needed to explore. The place was claustrophobic, with piles of books up to the ceiling and a strong smell of mold. At the bottom of the store, on a shelf covered with dust, I found an untitled copy. The cover was of cracked leather, without any detail except for an engraved symbol that looked like a circle with crossing lines in the middle. The bookseller, an old man who barely spoke, sold me the book for a pittance, as if he wanted to get rid of it. Only later, at the hotel, I realized that there was something very strange in that book. As I leafed through it, I noticed that most of it was old-fashioned science fiction, but one passage made me stop. She described a man named Elon, a visionary genius who would dedicate his life to bringing humanity to Mars. So far, it could be a coincidence, but the details were frighteningly specific. The text mentioned reusable ships, created to cross the skies with calculated precision, something that definitely did not exist in 1890. Even more disturbing, there was an illustration of a ship that looked like an almost exact replica of the Falcon 9 rocket. I tried to rationalize, thinking it might be a case of pareidolia or my mind playing tricks. But as I continued reading, I began to feel uncomfortable, as if something was watching me. The feeling of being observed became more intense as I went through the book. There was a whole section about a machine called the Modeler of Destiny. The text described it as a revolutionary invention capable of rewriting past events to shape the future of humanity. The implications were terrifying, but what really left me with a knot in my stomach was the warning. The machine must never fall into human hands. Those who try to manipulate fate have found a tragic end. I closed the book and tried to calm myself down. Perhaps it was just another absurd fiction of his time, something that should not be taken seriously. But then I heard a voice. The sound came from the radio next to the bed, which was off since I entered the room. It was a distorted, almost robotic voice, repeating the same phrase. "You found your way." My heart popped, and I turned to check the radio. It was off, no battery or power connected. Took the book again, trying to understand what was happening. It was when I noticed something even more strange. The pages were different. Passages I had read before now seemed rearranged, with new words emerging where there was previously only blank space. "The driver is chosen," said a bold sentence. My whole body became stiff reading those words. It was as if the book were alive, responding to my presence. The lights in the room began to flash, and the radio, which I was sure was off, went back to emit noises. Now it was a mixture of static and something that looked like heavy breathing. My instinct was to throw the book away, but it was as if my hands were glued to it. I continued to flip through the pages, almost by impulse, until something even more strange happened. A new page began to form before my eyes. The ink seemed to emerge from the paper, line by line, as I watched, unable to look away. The text describes events that were frighteningly familiar. He mentioned a book collector who would find the modeler of fate, and in doing so, trigger a series of events that would lead to destruction. His name? Mine. I almost dropped the book when I saw my name written there, followed by a phrase that froze my blood. He reads, and the cycle begins. At that moment, the radio gave a loud scream, like an alarm, and all the lights in the room went out. I was in the darkness, hearing only my breath and the sound of the radio, which now repeated a sentence in a metallic tone. Fate is inevitable. At that moment, my body seemed frozen. Even in the dark, I could feel the presence of something in the room. It was not just my imagination. The air was heavier, as if being compressed, and an almost tangible feeling that I was being observed took hold of me. My cell phone, which was on the bedside table, began to vibrate frantically, the screen blinking, but without any apparent notification. When I finally got the courage to pick it up, the screen showed something that didn't make sense. A text that wasn't from any app or message, just floating in the middle of the display. "You can't escape the cycle." I tried to turn off the phone, but the power button did not respond. Meanwhile, the book, which I had left on the floor, began to emit a low sound, a constant buzzing that made my ears thump. The dim light of the cell phone screen revealed something even more disturbing. A new phrase had appeared in the book, written in a calligraphy that seemed rushed. "The modeler of destiny chose you. Complete or disappear." The words seemed to vibrate on paper, as if they were alive. As I tried to move away, a heavy sound came from the corridor like striding steps. I was alone in the hotel, but at that moment, I was sure it was no longer. The steps in the corridor were slow and methodical, as if who or what was there knew exactly where I was. My instinct was to not open the door, but morbid curiosity and fear kept me paralyzed. I held my breath as the shadow of something, impossible to say what, began to form under the crack of the door. It was dense and seemed to move independently, like live smoke. I knew I should run, but my body just didn't respond. The book's hum increased, as if it was synchronized with the steps, increasingly close. The door began to vibrate, as if someone was pushing it lightly, testing the lock. And then came a sound. Not a human sound, but something mechanical, distorted, almost metallic. "Complete the cycle," said the voice, clearly coming from inside the room. I turned, desperately looking for the source, but there was no one. My heart beat so fast it seemed to be about to explode. The book was open, although I had not touched it, and the new message on the page seemed to call me. "Open the door." I don't know what made me do it, but before I knew it, my hands were turning the handle. When I opened the door, the corridor was completely dark, darker than it should be, as if the light had been sucked into somewhere. The air seemed to vibrate, charged with a low sound that did not come from any specific place. I looked both ways, trying to find the origin of the steps or shadow that I saw before, but there was nothing. Nothing but that unbearable feeling that I was not alone. When I stepped out, the ground seemed unstable, as if I was walking on something that wasn't solid. Every step echoed, even if I was barefoot. Suddenly I heard the voice again, now clear and unmistakable, coming from some distant point in the corridor. "You are the chosen one. Complete the cycle." The words seemed to pierce my mind, and before I could react, something began to materialize in front of me. At first, it was only a shadow, but it was taking shape. It was tall, thin and irregular, like a figure made of electric wires or broken lines, moving erratically. In place of the face, there was only a smooth surface like glass, and inside that face I saw my own reflection, but I was not alone. Behind me in the reflection, an indistinct figure moved closer than I imagined. My body is locked. I wanted to turn around, confirm that what was in the reflection was really behind me, but something told me that if I looked, there would be no way back. The figure in front of me, with that face like a distorted mirror, took a step towards me, and the vibration in the air became so intense that my ears began to whiz. It didn't have any real sound, but it was as if the silence was screaming inside my head. Then she raised an arm, if I can call it that, and pointed to the book, which was now floating a few inches off the ground just behind her. The book began to spin slowly, emitting a faint light, like a headlamp in a dense fog. The pages turned on their own, and each time a new page opened, the figure seemed to waver and vibrate, as if connected to the book in some way. When the book stopped, I could clearly see a new written phrase, "Choose your destination." Before I could understand what it meant, I felt something touch my shoulder. It was light, almost like a breeze, but as cold as dry ice. My heart almost came out of my mouth, and I instinctively turned around. There was nothing there, but when I looked back, the figure was gone. The book was on the floor, closed, as if nothing had happened. For a few seconds, I stood still, trying to understand what had just happened. The corridor was empty again, but the air still carried that oppressive feeling, as if something was watching me, even though I could not see. I looked at the book on the floor, now inert, and felt a mixture of relief and dread. It was as if he was waiting for me to catch him. Against all common sense, I crouched and held him. As my fingers touched the cover, I felt a wave of heat rising up through my arm, as if the book was pulsating with life of its own. Before I could let go, the lights in the hallway blinked and went out for good. I was again in total darkness, with only the sound of my breath and the crushing weight of silence. Suddenly my phone started to vibrate in my pocket. I caught it, desperate for any light source or connection with reality. On the screen, a new message appeared, but it was not from any known number. Last chance, complete or perish. My hands were shaking so much that I almost dropped the phone. It was then that something broke the silence. Steps. Slowly they approached from behind me. But this time, I knew I was not alone. The steps got higher and closer, as if something heavy was walking slowly towards me. Each impact seemed to reverberate on the ground and inside my chest. My whole body panicked, and I turned the phone to light up the hallway behind me. The light was dim, shaking with my hands, but it was enough for me to see something that made me freeze. A figure was standing there, a few meters away. It was tall, almost touching the ceiling, but its shape made no sense. It was as if it were constantly moving, stretching and twisting, without ever being completely solid. I was paralyzed as she took another step, her body emitting a low and agonizing sound like wood breaking slowly. My instincts screamed to run, but my legs didn't respond. The book, still in my hand, began to warm again, and when I looked at it, I saw that the pages were opening themselves. A new phrase appeared, written in an irregular and desperate handwriting. Choose quickly. Your life depends on it. Before I could process, I felt a presence by my side, as if someone was very close. I didn't have the courage to look, but the cold metallic smell made me know that it was there. It was then that the cell phone light blinked and went completely out. In absolute darkness, the only sound was my own panting breath and that low noise, like something dragging claws across the ground. I felt the presence next to me, but could not see anything, and that was even worse. My mind struggled to find a way out, anything I could do to escape from that situation, but it seemed like the air around me was closing in, as if something invisible was crushing me. The book, which I still held tightly, began to vibrate slightly, emitting an almost unbearable heat. He seemed to want to tell me something, as if it was the only key to get out of there. Without much thought, I opened the book again, trying to see something, anything, even in the darkness. And that's when the light came back, but not from where I expected. The pages began to shine, with an intensity that made no sense, illuminating the corridor around me. The figure, now completely visible, was a few meters away from me. She was monstrous, but at the same time strangely human, as if she were a distorted shadow of something that was once a person. His arms extended at impossible angles, and where the eyes should be, there were only two deep, shining holes. She pointed to the book, and then to me, as if telling me I had a choice to make. It was then that I understood, either I completed what the book wanted, or I would not leave there alive. The figure began to approach slowly, and the corridor seemed to close around it, as if the space was shrinking. The heat coming from the book increased, burning my palm, but I could not let go. The words on the pages began to rearrange again, forming phrases that seemed to shout in my mind, "Make the choice. Freedom or eternity." My heart popped. What did that mean? How should I decide something without knowing the consequences? The shadow was almost within my reach now, its erratic movement filling the air with a muffled sound, as if time were bending around us. With an almost irrational impulse, I turned the page of the book. The words were now clearer, almost imperative. Write the name. A blank space appeared below the sentence, as if he expected me to fill it. There was no pen, but it was as if the book itself was demanding something from me, something I barely understood. At that moment, I felt something cold touch my leg. I looked down and saw a thin shadow, like a tentacle, winding around my ankle. My body panicked, but before I could react, the figure finally stopped. She raised one of her shapeless arms and pointed directly at the blank space in the book. I knew what I had to do, but I had no idea who or what I should write. I didn't know what to write. My mind was in chaos, and the book seemed to be beating in my hands as if it had a life of its own. The shadow around me began to squeeze my ankle, the cold cutting up my leg and paralyzing my movements. I tried to pull my hand away from the pages, but it was as if something invisible forced me to hold it. Desperate, I shouted to the void, "What a name!" My voice echoed through the corridor, but there was no answer. Suddenly, an intrusive thought crossed my mind, something that seemed not to be mine. "Write yours." My fingers began to move on their own, as if controlled by another force. With my finger, I drew my own name in the blank space, the ink coming from nowhere. As soon as I was finished, the figure dissolved into a wave of shadows, like smoke being sucked into nothingness. The book closed with a deafening snap, and everything around me was silent. For a moment, I thought it was over, but then I realized something was very wrong. The corridor was not the same, and I could not remember where I had come from. The conspiracy of the immortals. Why do the most powerful men in the world never age? And if I tell you that they have discovered the secret of immortality, and you are part of the price they paid? It all started with a tip that seemed harmless, like so many others I received. A fellow editor mentioned, coincidentally, that an antique collector had in his possession a set of rare portraits of historical figures who looked almost identically to some of the most influential men in the world today. He spoke as a curiosity, something to fill an article about history and bizarre coincidences. I decided to investigate, more for fun than any other reason. I made a visit to the collector, who was a reserved man, almost paranoid, who only agreed to meet me after much insistence. He lived in an old house, full of books and objects that seemed to have come out of a museum. When he showed me the pictures, the air in the room seemed to change. The images were not only similar to world leaders, they were identical. One of them showed a man who could easily be Elon Musk, dressed in 18th century clothes. Another was the portrait of a European aristocrat who looked like the exact copy of Donald Trump. The collector, visibly nervous, told me that these pieces had been passed on by generations of his family, but that no one could ever trace their exact origin. When I asked how he was sure that they were not modern forgeries, he took out a magnifying glass and showed me small details, craquelures in the ink, aging marks on the paper, which proved that they were indeed old. It was then that he handed me something he called the definitive proof, a letter written in a language he could not identify. As soon as I touched the paper, a strange sensation ran through my body, like a cold coming from inside. When I held the letter, it was as if something inside me knew that it should not be there. The texture of the paper was strange, almost greasy, and the words, written in a minute calligraphy, seemed to move under the light, making it impossible to focus on them for long. I asked the collector if he had ever shown it to a linguistics expert, but he shook his head quickly, as if he were afraid of the idea itself. He told me that all the people who tried to translate the letter ended up sick, with unexplained symptoms, and that one of them had disappeared completely. He wanted me to take the letter with me, and said she wanted to be found. It sounded like paranoia, but I accepted. After all, it was my job to investigate the unusual. Back at my apartment, I decided to scan the document to try to analyze it later. That's when things started getting weird. When I passed the file to the computer, it looked normal at first, but after a few seconds, the screen started flashing. An image appeared quickly before everything turned off. It was a face. I can't explain what was wrong with him, but he seemed incomplete, as if pieces were missing, and the eyes were only dark holes. I tried to restart the computer, but it didn't turn on. When I turned around to get the letter from where I had left it, it was no longer there. I searched the whole apartment, but it was as if I had never brought that with me. It was then that my phone rang, and a metallic voice, without emotion, said only one sentence. "You already know too much." After hearing that voice, my mind panicked. I didn't recognize the number, and before I could answer, the call went down. I kept looking at the phone, trying to process what had just happened. The missing letter, the strange image on the computer, and now this? Everything seemed surreal. but there was no way to deny that something was happening. I spent the rest of the night trying to find logical explanations, going through my memory to understand if I could have left the letter somewhere else. But the only thing I could feel was a growing discomfort, as if I was no longer alone in the apartment. The feeling was so strong that I began to avoid looking at the dark corners of the room. The next morning, I went to work as if nothing had happened, but the tension followed me like a shadow. I decided not to tell anyone about the call or the disappearance of the letter, fearing it would seem paranoid. It was only when I opened my email that I realized that this would not end so soon. There was a message without a sender with the subject, "You are part now." I opened the message with my hands shaking, and all it contained was a low-resolution photo of a frame. I recognized immediately. It was one of the portraits that the collector had shown me. But there was something different. At the bottom of the picture, behind the man depicted, there was a hooded figure. I didn't remember seeing it before, but it seemed so real that it was impossible to ignore. I looked at the picture of the portrait on the screen for several minutes, trying to understand what was wrong. The figure in the background seemed to be watching me, although it has no visible face. It was as if she was aware of my presence, even through the image. It made no sense. I decided to go back to the collector to confront him about it, but when I called the number he gave me, I only received an automatic message saying that the number did not exist. That made me even more uneasy. I decided to go directly to his house. When I arrived, something seemed different. The curtains were closed, and the sign, "No parking," at the entrance had disappeared. I rang the doorbell several times, but nobody answered. By impulse, I pushed the door, and to my surprise it was unlocked. The interior of the house was empty. There was no furniture, no books, no pictures. It was as if nobody had lived there for years. The smell of mold and dust was suffocating, but what disturbed me most was the absolute silence. I went into what was before the room where he showed me the pictures, and on the floor, there was something that did not make sense: the letter. It was the same one he had given me, the one that disappeared from my apartment. As I leaned down to pick her up, I heard a sound coming from upstairs, like footsteps. My heart pounded. The house looked abandoned, but I knew I was not alone. I took the letter and started to retreat towards the door, but as soon as I looked back, I saw a hooded figure standing in the entrance. The hooded figure blocks the exit, immobile, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that she was watching me. My mind screamed for me to run, but my legs seemed frozen. The letter was still in my hand, and I could feel a strange heat coming from it, as if she were alive. The figure took a single step forward, the sound of the movement echoing through the empty house, and that was enough to take me out of the state of paralysis. I looked quickly around, looking for another way out. The window on the opposite side of the room was my only option. Without thinking twice, I ran towards her, but before I could reach her, the room seemed to change. I don't know how to describe it, but it was as if the walls and the floor warped, pushing me back. Suddenly, the figure was in front of me, as if it had crossed space without even moving. His hood rose slightly, revealing something that left me breathless, a face identical to mine. But it was not normal. He was pale, with black eyes like coal, and an expression completely devoid of life. Before I could react, she raised her hand, pointing directly at the letter. At that moment, I began to hear voices, not from the picture, but from the letter. They whispered my name repeatedly, between words in a language I could not understand. It was unbearable, as if they were invading my mind. Instinctively, I dropped the letter, and it fell to the ground, but the whisper continued, louder and closer. The figure disappeared, but something told me that it was far from over. As soon as the figure disappeared, an oppressive silence took over the house. But silence did not bring relief. It brought a different kind of fear, as if something was surrounding me, waiting for the right moment to attack. I looked at the letter on the floor. She now looked different, with the words glistening slightly, as if they were being recorded on paper at that very moment. The feeling that it was not just an object, but something alive was unbearable. Even so, I could not resist. I took the letter again, as if it was the only thing that could give me answers. As soon as I touched it, my vision darkened for a second. When I saw it again, I was no longer at home. What surrounded me was an unknown, dark room with damp stone walls and no windows. In the center, there was a table with something that looked like an old mirror. My own image was reflected, but something was wrong. My reflection did not follow my movements. He watched me, and the black eyes were the same as the hooded figure. Before I could move away, the reflection started to speak, with a voice that sounded like mine but distorted. "You've been part of it before, and always will be. There's no way out." It was then that I felt something behind me, a strange heat that seemed to pulse. It didn't take me to turn around to see the hooded figure was there again. But now there were others. A dozen of them, all motionless, surrounding the room. The hooded figures were still for a few seconds, but the weight of their presence was overwhelming. I was surrounded, and the only thing I could do was to back up until I hit the table with the mirror. My reflection kept watching me, as if I was waiting for something. I don't know where I got the courage, but I started to scream, demanding to know what was happening. It was then that all the figures moved at the same time, as if they were a single entity. They formed a perfect circle around me, and the buzz I heard at the collector's house came back, but now it was deafening. The voices in my head returned, but they were not whispers, they were screams. In the midst of chaos, the letter I still held began to shine brightly, almost burning my hand. I looked at it and saw that new words were being formed on the paper, accept or perish. Before I could understand what it meant, my reflection in the mirror began to transform. He smiled in a way that my face could never, something evil and predatory. Suddenly, one of the figures approached me, raising his arm, but as before, he did not touch me. Instead, I felt my body start to writhe, as if it was being pulled out of myself. I knew at that moment that I was being taken to something that I could not understand, but already possessed me. The letter fell from my hand, and everything around me became black. The prophecy of the end, Baron Trump and the underground journey. An ancient book predicted the emergence of a chosen one who would destroy humanity. What is hidden in the underground tunnels that no one dares to explore? I have always been fascinated by obscure literature, especially those old and strange books that seem to contain more questions than answers. That's how I ended up coming across The Underground Travels of Baron Trump while researching forgotten texts for a college paper. The title caught my attention immediately, but what really struck me were the detailed descriptions of underground places and events that seemed very advanced for the time when the book was written. The most intriguing part was the mention of secret tunnels, supposedly located under an abandoned park a few hours from my city. Curiosity has overcome common sense and decides to investigate on their own. I arrived at the site in the late afternoon, armed with a flashlight, a rudimentary map that I drew based on the descriptions of the book, and a growing feeling of anxiety. The park was everything I imagined, and more. Dead trees, rusty benches, and an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to push me out. After about half an hour of searching, I found an entrance partially hidden by roots and vegetation. It was exactly as the book described, a stone tunnel with worn symbols carved in the entrance. When I lit the inside with the flashlight, I felt a shiver run through my spine. Something was wrong there. The air had a strange smell, almost metallic, and seemed to vibrate slightly, as if the tunnel had a life of its own. Against all instincts, I entered. The first steps inside the tunnel were the most difficult. The air was heavy, and every sound seemed amplified, from my footsteps to the slight hum that seemed to come from somewhere far away. I kept walking, trying to ignore the feeling that something was watching me. The book's description was frighteningly accurate. Every curve, every drop on the floor was exactly like the pages I read. After walking for about 15 minutes, I found a larger chamber with a ceiling so high that my flashlight could not reach. In the center, there was a pedestal, and above it, something that made me freeze in place, a book. It was very similar to the copy I had found in the library, but it looked older, as if it had been there for centuries. As I approached, I noticed that it was open on a page with disturbing illustrations. One of them showed a hooded figure holding what seemed to be a map, and next to it an image that looked like me, with precise details of my face and clothes. It was then that I heard the sound of footsteps echoing through the tunnel from which I had come. I was no longer alone. I turned off the flashlight on impulse, trying to hide in the darkness, but the tunnel seemed to amplify the footsteps of whoever was coming. They were slow, drawn in, as if the person knew exactly where I was. My heart beat so hard that it seemed to echo in the chamber. I crouched behind the pedestal, holding the flashlight tightly, as if it could protect me in some way. While I waited, I noticed that the sound of the steps stopped, but the silence was even worse. I knew someone or something was there with me, but had no idea where or what it was. Suddenly, I heard a voice whispering something. It was low, but it didn't seem to come from a single direction. It was everywhere, reverberating on the walls of the tunnel. Could not understand what he was saying, but the tone was urgent, almost like a command. My instinct was to run away, but my legs didn't respond. It was then that I noticed something on the pedestal. The book had changed pages. Don't know how or when, but now it showed an image of a group of figures hooded in a circle around something that looked like an altar. In the center of the circle, there was a person lying down, clearly unconscious, and somehow I knew it was a representation of what was about to happen to me. I was about to run, but before I could move, the chamber was filled with a deafening sound, like a chorus of voices echoing from all directions. I looked around desperately, but could not see anyone. The flashlight began to fail, blinking at irregular intervals, and each time the light went out, it seemed that the darkness around me became denser, almost palpable. When the light came back, I saw something that made me lose my breath. Hooded figures emerging from the shadows, one by one. They did not walk, but slid, moving as if they were part of the tunnel itself. They formed a circle around the pedestal, blocking all exits. My instinct was to shout, to do something, but it was as if the air had been pulled out of my lungs. Then one of the figures came closer. His hood completely hid my face, but even so, I felt that I was being observed, studied. She reached out slowly and pointed to the book. Without understanding why, I felt compelled to touch it. As my fingers touched the page, a sharp cold ran through my body, and the deafening sound stopped instantly. The page changed again, but now it showed a single word written in gigantic letters. Choose. I didn't know what choice meant, but I knew it wasn't something simple. The word seemed to pulse on the page, as if it was alive, and the pressure around me only increased. The hooded figures were completely still, but the feeling that they were watching me was unbearable. That's when I realized there was something under the pedestal, an empty space, like a small excavated chamber. Inside it, something was dimly shining, but I could not distinguish what it was. I felt an almost physical force pushing me to look closer, as if the book was guiding me. When I knelt to see what was in the chamber, I realized it was a metallic object, something that looked like an old key. As soon as I touched it, I felt a heat rising from my hand, different from the cold I felt before. The page of the book changed again, but this time it showed two doors. One bright, almost angelic, and another dark, shrouded in shadows. The word choice was blinking between the two images. Before I could decide what make, the closest hooded figure took a step forward, and for the first time I saw something coming out of the hood. A face, or at least what should be one. It was like a distorted reflection of my own face, but with completely black eyes. She bowed her head, pointing at the key in my hand as if she was waiting. Holding the key, I felt a wave of panic rise up my body. The hooded figure was still standing, tilting his head almost curiously, but there was something deeply wrong with it, something that made my stomach turn. I tried to release the key, but my fingers did not obey, as if it was glued in my hand. The two doors in the book shone with increasing intensity, as if they were demanding a decision. The sound around me came back, but this time it was different. Voices whispering, each trying to convince me to choose one of the doors. Some said the bright door was salvation, while others insisted it was a trap. The silence was broken by a bang. When I looked up, I saw that the camera was changing. The walls began to move, bending as if the entire tunnel were alive. The hooded figures began to approach, their movements slow but relentless. They were surrounding me, and the only way out seemed to be to choose one of the doors. Despair took hold of me, and without thinking I touched the image of the dark door in the book. As soon as I did that, the key in my hand warmed up, almost burning, and a deafening sound filled the chamber. The figures stopped, and for a moment I thought I had made the wrong choice. But then the dark door began to form, right in front of me, as if being torn out of the air itself. The dark door appeared in front of me as something alive, pulsating and emitting an almost unbearable heat. The sound around became more intense, like a pressure that crushed my ears. The hooded figures stood still, but the air around them seemed to vibrate, as if they were waiting for something. My hand still held the key, which now looked as cold as ice, and I knew I needed to use it. With my other hand shaking, I reached the door lock. As soon as the key came in, I heard a click, but it wasn't like a mechanical sound. It was something deeper, as if the tunnel itself had been awakened. The door opened slowly, revealing an absolute emptiness. There was no light, no form, just a darkness that seemed to suck everything around. I didn't want to go in, but something pulled me, an invisible force that made me step forward. As soon as I crossed the entrance, the sound stopped. Not completely. It was as if the silence had its own weight, filling the space in an oppressive way. I tried to look back, but the door had already disappeared. It was somewhere new, a place that should not exist. It was an endless vastness, with a floor covered by symbols that sparkled dimly, and in the center, a figure that made me freeze. It was myself, or at least a version of me, standing still and watching with completely black eyes. The sight of that distorted version of myself was like a punch in the stomach. I was paralyzed, unable to move or look away. The figure studied me with a weak and empty smile, as if he knew something I did not know, something I did not want to know. Around her, the symbols on the ground began to shine more intensely, forming a pattern that seemed alive, moving like snakes of light. I tried to talk, ask what was happening, but no sound came out of my mouth. It was then that the figure began to approach, the steps echoing in that void impossible, as if each movement resonated inside my head. When she stopped a few meters from me, I realized that she was not exactly like me. The traces were familiar, but there was something wrong, as if it had been molded from imperfect memories. His black eyes reflected my own image, but with something more. Behind me, I could see the hooded figures, although I knew that they were not physically there. The distorted version of me pointed to the ground, where the bright symbols began to rearrange themselves, forming words that I could understand. The cycle is complete. Before I could react, she leaned over, coming a few inches from my face, and whispered in a voice that was a mixture of mine and something profoundly inhuman. "You should never have come in." As soon as those words were whispered, a shiver ran through my body. Before I could react, I felt a sudden pull, as if gravity itself had changed. The ground under my feet began to fragment, the bright symbols breaking into pieces that floated around me. The figure, which was a distorted version of me, simply disappeared, as if it had never been there. I fell, or at least that's what it seemed. The feeling was being sucked into an invisible tunnel, while flashes of images that I did not understand flickered around me. Places I never saw, unknown faces and symbols that seemed to observe me. When I finally stopped, I found myself back in the original chamber. The pedestal was still there, but the book had disappeared. The hooded figures were around me again, but this time they were motionless, like statues. For a brief moment, I thought I had escaped, but something was wrong. The air looked different, heavier, and the camera was changed. I looked at the walls and realized that the symbols had transformed. They now formed words that I could understand, and the phrase he read froze my blood. "You are part now." Before I could process, I heard a distant sound, footsteps coming from the tunnel. Only this time, they didn't seem to come towards me. Instead, they seemed to go away, as if something was leaving the camera. When I looked at my hands, the key was still there, but now it was completely black, as if it had been burned. It was then that I realized I had not escaped. I was the next guardian. The Tesla letters, warnings of a dystopian future. Letters written by Nikola Tesla, which should never be read, began to appear 80 years after his death. What they reveal is more frightening than any conspiracy theory. It all started so banal that I still have trouble believing how things escalated so fast. I work as a programmer in a startup, and my routine is predictable, spending hours in front of screens, dealing with codes and reports. It was on a common morning that I found the first letter. It was in the mailbox of the building where I live, a simple envelope without a sender or stamps. The only thing written was my name, Michael Carter, with accurate and old-fashioned handwriting. I thought it was strange, but I didn't pay much attention. I thought it was a mistake or a weird ad. When I opened it, I was confused. Inside was a worn sheet of paper with diagrams and notes that seemed extremely complex, but at the same time familiar. One of the schemes was virtually identical to a prototype my team was working on, something that should only exist on our servers. I decided to take the letter to work, thinking that maybe it was some kind of joke or leak of information. But nobody knew anything. That night, when I got home, I found a second letter just like the first. This time the text was clearer, a warning. It said something like, "The lines are about to cross. You have little time to correct." It didn't make sense, but what really made me restless was the ending. A signature, and Tesla. My mind spiraled. There was no way that was real. Nikola Tesla had been dead for decades. I decided to ignore it, thinking it was some marketing trick or elaborate joke. That's when things started getting really weird. That night, as I tried to forget the letters, my apartment started having unexplained problems. First, the lights started flashing, but not intermittently. It was almost like a pattern, blinking precisely, almost rhythmically. I thought it was some electrical problem, but the strange thing is that my computer, even when turned off, started to emit a slight buzzing. When I approached, he called Elon, straight to a black screen, with lines of code appearing in a sequence that I did not recognize. It was as if the system was running something on its own. I tried to turn it off, but the buttons didn't respond. Only when I pulled the plug did it finally stop, but the buzz continued, as if inside the apartment itself. I went to the kitchen, trying to calm down, but when I returned to the room, I noticed something that made me freeze. Another letter was on my desk, even though I was sure there was nothing there minutes before. The envelope was the same, with my name written by hand. This time, inside there was only one sentence: "You ignored the first warning." Along with that, a small stain of something that looked like oil was on the paper. When I looked at the walls of the room, I saw something even more disturbing. Small red dots shone in the shadows, like eyes watching me. I tried to turn on all the lights, but they didn't respond. It was as if something was surrounding me, something I knew I was trying to ignore the inevitable. At that moment, my breath was heavy. The red dots in the shadows seemed to move, blinking in a disorderly way, as if they were surrounding me. Took my phone to try to call someone, anyone, but it was completely dead, even if it was charged. The buzz in the apartment seemed to increase, as if it came from the walls, and then I saw a mouse. He was standing in the corner of the room, his eyes shining in that same red tone. I thought it was some reflection of the light, but there wasn't enough light for that. Two more rats came out from under the bed, both with the same intense eyes. They did not move like normal animals. They were there, motionless, watching me, and I knew it was not natural. It was when the letter on the table began to burn, but without flames. The edge of the paper darkened, as if it were deteriorating on its own. I tried to throw it away, but before I could touch it, another message appeared, written in the same old-fashioned calligraphy. "The future is lost if you continue." The words disappeared immediately, leaving the paper completely blank. At that point, the tinnitus seemed to be inside my head, almost deafening me. The only thing I could think of was leaving that apartment. Took a jacket and ran out, without even looking back. In the hallway, the lights were flashing exactly the same pattern I saw at home, and when I got to the street, I realized that my life would never be the same. I ran aimlessly through the streets, trying to get as far away from my building as I could. Even outside, I felt as if something was still watching me, as if the buzz that seemed to have stayed in the apartment still echoed in my mind. I stopped at a cafe that was open 24 hours, one of the few places where I felt minimally safe. I ordered a coffee, trying to calm my nerves, but it was when I took my cell phone to check if there was any sign that I noticed something disturbing. There was a new notification, even with the device completely without battery minutes before. It was a message from an unknown number, and the text was short but direct. You cannot run away from what has already begun. My first reaction was to delete the message, but before I could, the screen of the phone erased again. It was not possible that this was a coincidence. I looked around, trying to find some explanation, but the noise of steps behind me made me freeze. When I turned around, I saw something that made no sense. A man in a suit, with impeccable appearance, was sitting at a table at the bottom of the cafeteria, staring at me. He had nothing particularly scary, except for the fixed look and a smile that did not seem human. On the table in front of him, there was an envelope identical to the one I had found before. It was as if he was waiting for me to go there, but everything inside of me screamed to run away. I could not move. The man kept staring at me, motionless, and the smile on his face seemed more a warning than an attempt at sympathy. Everything around me seemed to disappear. I no longer heard the sound of the cafeteria, nor the conversations of other people. It was as if that moment was isolated from the rest of the world. I knew that if I approached, things would only get worse, but I also knew that ignoring him was not an option. With hesitant steps, I went to the table, my hands shaking as I sat facing him. He said nothing, just pushed the envelope towards me without looking away. When I opened the envelope, the air around me seemed to get heavier. Inside, there was a single piece of paper with more diagrams and a short message. Your code is the key. Use it, or everyone will pay the price. My heart has popped. The diagram was from a software system that I was developing in the company, something that had not yet been shared even with the team. There was no way anyone could have known that. I looked at the man, waiting for some explanation, but he just stood up, adjusted his suit, and went out the door, disappearing into the darkness. When I looked again at the envelope, it was empty. But the buzzing, that terrible sound, started again, this time coming directly from inside my head. That buzzing was unbearable, as if it was mixing with my own thoughts, making it impossible to concentrate. Took my things and left the cafeteria, still feeling that something was watching me. The street was deserted, the silence disturbing. As I walked back home, I began to notice small red lights flashing in the corners, like the eyes I had seen before. But now there were more, many more. When I finally got to my building, I hesitated before entering. Didn't want to go back, but I also didn't know where to go. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the growing panic, and got into the elevator. As soon as the doors closed, I realized something was wrong. The buttons started to blink, and the elevator went up and down without control, stopping on random floors. Finally, he stopped at my floor, but the lights were off. I took my phone to light the hallway, and that's when I noticed my door was ajar. I knew I had locked it before I left. My instinct was to run, but something pulled me inside, as if I needed to see what was happening. Upon entering, I found my room completely destroyed. Papers were scattered, and my computer was on, displaying a code I had never seen before. In the center of the screen, a message blinked in red letters. You are next. When reading that message, my body locked. It was impossible to look away from the screen. The code kept running, endless lines of symbols and numbers that made no sense. The buzzing in my head got louder, almost making me dizzy, and for a moment I swear I saw something move in the corner of the room. Turned off the monitor in a reflex act, trying to stop whatever it was. The room went silent, but it didn't take long for me to realize that the noise wasn't coming from the computer. It was coming from inside the walls. They were small scratches, as if something was moving inside, something that should not be there. Suddenly, the scratches stopped, and the silence was replaced by steps coming from the corridor of my apartment. This time they were not slow and drawn. They were fast, determined. I ran to the door to lock it, but before I could reach the handle, it started spinning on its own. I pushed the door with all my strength, trying to keep it closed, but I felt that there was something on the other side, something much stronger than me. Then I heard again that metallic voice which seemed to echo in the depths of my mind. "It's time to finish what you started." At the same instant, the door stopped moving, and everything was in complete silence. When I opened it slowly, the corridor was empty, but on the floor, right at the entrance, there was another envelope. Took the envelope with trembling hands. It was identical to the previous ones, except that it was completely dry, even with the humidity that seemed to permeate the corridor. When I opened, I found a single piece of paper, but this time there were no diagrams or enigmatic phrases. Only one address, written in large black letters, 257 Ravenswood Lane. I had never heard of that place, but something inside me knew I had no choice. It was as if every fiber of my being was being pulled there, even knowing that nothing good could wait for me. Took my keys and left, almost like an automaton, without thinking what could happen. The journey was short, but each kilometer seemed to take an eternity. The address led me to an abandoned industrial building on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by barbed wire and full of forbidden entry signs. There was something strange in the place, as if the air itself was denser, making it difficult to breathe. As soon as I passed the gate, the hum came back louder than ever, as if it were coming directly from the building. I entered through a side door, and inside the environment was even more oppressive. Everything was dusty, but what really caught my attention was the faint brightness of a screen at the bottom of the shed. The same message I saw in my apartment was blinking. "You are next." Only this time, it was accompanied by an image. It was a picture of me, taken at that exact moment. When I saw the picture, I felt a cold running through my spine. It was not possible that it was real. The picture showed exactly where I was, with the same expression of fear imprinted on my face. I looked around, trying to find any sign of a camera, but there was nothing. It was as if the photo had been taken from an impossible angle, as if the building itself was watching me. The message on the screen changed suddenly, replacing the photo with another phrase, "Enter the next room." My heart popped, and for the first time I thought about just running away. But something held me there. It was not just curiosity, it was as if I was stuck to a destiny that had already been mapped out. The door next to it was half open, and a faint glow escaped through the cracks. Every step I took towards her seemed heavier, as if the air itself was pushing me back. When I finally opened the door, I came across something that I will never forget. In the center of the room was a table, and on it, a strange device covered with wires and metal plates. It emitted the same hum that had been tormenting me from the beginning. Next to the device, there was a last letter, identical to the others, but with a message written in large and gloomy letters. "Activate it or everything will be destroyed." I felt the panic take over me, but before I could think about what to do, I heard footsteps echoing again, this time coming directly behind me. The steps behind me were slow and calculated, each reverberating on the walls of the empty shed. I turned into a reflection, but there was no one there. The buzzing of the device on the table became louder, almost pulsating, as if it was reacting to my presence. I took the letter with trembling hands, trying to find some clue of what activate meant. There was a button in the center of the device, small and shiny, as if it was waiting for me to press it. My instinct was to not do this, but the rising sound of the hum was like a constant threat, pushing me towards decision. It was then that the lights of the shed began to blink and shadows form on the walls. They were not normal shadows. They looked human, but distorted, like figures dragged into another dimension. The shadows began to move, slowly approaching the table, and I knew that I could not stand still. The only thing I could think of was, what if this is the only way out? I closed my eyes and pressed the button. At the same instant, the hum stopped, and the silence that took over the place was deafening. But then came the worst. My vision was blurred, and images began to flash in my mind. Cities in ruins, skies covered by black clouds, and at the center of it all, a figure with bright eyes staring back at me. It was Tesla, but he didn't look human. He whispered something that echoed in my mind. "You chose, but you will never escape." When the voice of Tesla echoed in my mind, I was taken by a feeling of emptiness, as if something had been torn out of me. My legs gave way, and I fell to the ground next to the device. The shadows on the walls began to move frantically, almost as if they were celebrating. The tinnitus came back, but now it looked different, more intense, more alive. The device on the table began to emit a pulsating red light, which filled the whole room. I tried to get up, but my body did not obey. Tesla's voice kept on in my head, repeating those words, "You will never escape." Then the red light exploded in a flash, and when I opened my eyes, it was no longer in the shed. It was back to my apartment, but something was different. The walls had cracks that did not exist before, and the air was heavy, as if something was stuck there with me. My computer was on, and on the screen there was a last message. "The cycle has begun." Before I could process what was happening, I heard the sound of footsteps again, but this time they were inside the apartment. My reflection in the window began to change. It was no longer my face, but a distorted version with dark eyes and a smile that seemed broken. It was at that moment that I realized that even if I came home, I would never be safe.